Hey everyone, hopefully you guys are doing well from the comforts of wherever you may be. This is the second part of the civil rights movement lesson. There is another video I did on the civil rights movement. So if you haven't already, please check that out so that you can follow a continuous timeline. And so we're going to dive into, this video is going to dive into the kind of the later portions of the civil rights movement and it's going to result in some tragedy towards the end. So we'll get to that. So basically, during the civil rights movements, there are plenty of Supreme Court cases that dealing with regarding civil rights that gets decided. At this time, during the 50s and 60s, the Supreme Court is led by Judge Earl Warren, who was appointed Chief Justice of the United States in 1953. And Warren led the Supreme Court in making several decisions on key political and social issues, such as Brown v. Board of Education, that dealt with segregation in schools, dealt with Mapp versus Ohio, Gideon versus Wainwright, Miranda versus Arizona, and we'll get into a couple of these cases throughout the video. So, the Miranda decision of 1966, the Supreme Court ruled that suspects must immediately be notified of their rights. Rights to remain silent, right to a lawyer if they shouldn't, or if they could not afford one. And though criticized by many Americans, Miranda expanded the rights of the accused by guaranteeing equal rights to all citizens, regardless of their economic decision. And so hopefully this never happens to you, but if you're ever, pulled over or arrested, the police officers must tell you your rights. And this is all part of the Miranda decision. So a little bit of recap from the first part of the civil rights movement. Kennedy, especially towards the end of his presidency, was viewed as being progressive towards civil rights. However, in November of 1963, Kennedy was assassinated in Dallas, Texas, and Vice President Lyndon Johnson from Texas was sworn in as president. Politically, Johnson was very different than Kennedy. He spent years in Congress and knew how to get things done. And so here is a newspaper article about Kennedy's assassination. There's a lot of conspiracies about this, and so hopefully guys can do some research about what all happens, because it's pretty fascinating. So Lyndon B. Johnson carried on many of Kennedy's plans, including getting both the Civil Rights Act of 1964 and the Voting Rights Act of 1965 passed into law. And so there's a picture of Lyndon Johnson and Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., who was a major civil rights leader at the time. So Lyndon Johnson was able to get some of these important rights and laws passed. So in the previous video on civil rights, the Civil Rights Act of 1964 was signed into law after a 75-day filibuster in the Senate, and it was the most sweeping civil rights reform since Reconstruction. It outlawed discrimination in public places, established the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission, and withheld federal funds from segregated public programs. The Voting Rights Act basically addressed voting rights, and so to promote the lack of voting rights that the Civil Rights Act did not do, Dr. King led a protest in Selma, Alabama, where African Americans were being prevented from registering to vote, and this led to local police attacking marchers and beat them in front of live television. And King led the marches from Selma to Montgomery, the capital of Alabama, and this will eventually get the Voting Rights Act to be passed. And so President Johnson helps push through the Voting Rights Act. It suspended discriminatory practices such as literacy tests, poll taxes, anything that was seen as an obstacle for African Americans to vote. And this also sent federal troops to help register African Americans. And so, like I mentioned in the previous video, TV had a huge role and impact on how people viewed the Civil Rights Act. It led to more people being sympathetic towards the marchers. and yeah, the rest is history. So, President Johnson's other accomplishments. Johnson ran and won the 1964 presidential election in a landslide against Barry Goldwater. Johnson immediately set in motion his so-called Great Society plan, and this plan was kind of mimics Franklin D. Roosevelt's New Deal and focused on expanding aid to the poor through a variety of programs. And so some of these programs included Medicare and Medicaid, and this all happened during a 3-year period, and he was able to pass over 60 programs as a part of his Great Society. However, during this time period, the United States is also at war in Vietnam. That places a huge financial burden on the budget, the American budget. And so a lot of his programs kind of went to the wayside because the American military was focused on the Vietnam War, which we will cover later on. So, in 1968, this is seen as the most saddest year in American history. This was the year in which Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. was assassinated. He was in Memphis, Tennessee, and the day before he was assassinated, he gave a speech in front of sanitation workers who were on strike for low wages and harsh working conditions. And so, in the early evening of April 4th, Dr. King was shot and killed by James Earl Ray. And similar to President Kennedy's assassination, there are a lot of rumors and conspiracies about how this occurred. But hopefully, guys can do your research and to dive into what exactly happens on April 4th, 1968. And so Dr. King's death sparked a series of riots throughout the country. So Bobby Kennedy later on, this is also part of 1968 being a very sad year. Bobby Kennedy, who was John Kennedy's younger brother, served as U.S. Attorney General under his administration. Bobby Kennedy supported many of his brother's civil rights policies. He decides to run for president in 1968 after Lyndon B. Johnson decides not to run. And so as Democratic candidate, Kennedy went to California in June of 1968 and won that state's primary. Unfortunately, after greeting supporters at a hotel after his victory, Bobby Kennedy was assassinated by Sirhan, who basically was alleged to be a pro-Palestinian terrorist, and so he kills Bobby Kennedy. An interesting fact: he is still alive. He is serving a life sentence for killing Bobby Kennedy. And by end of 1968, 2 national leaders had been assassinated, and it led to a lot of turmoil and riots throughout the country. Also, to put the icing on the cake of 1968, in the Democratic National Convention, the DNC, was held in Chicago. There were 4,000 anti-war demonstrators that protested against the Vietnam War and tried to march to the convention site, but were met with over 11,000 Army and National Guardsmen and Chicago riot police. This results in several hundreds of injuries and a few deaths. And so this was a very chaotic moment and a chaotic year in America. And so protesters and bystanders were met with tear gas and beaten by the police, all within the full view of television cameras. And once again, TV captures everything. And this led to very sour tastes in a lot of American households. And so this wraps up the PowerPoint, the lesson on the Civil Rights Movement. Hopefully, guys learned something from this. And until next time.